second presentation then for the curriculum and pedagogy session that we have. This is Pat Glynn, who is an instructor here at Lakeland University, teaching music. And we're talking still about critical thinking and bias with his presentation, addressing cultural bias in music education, teaching music from a global perspective. Pat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Ruth, and it was great to sit through that presentation. That was great. It's nicely how it dovetails, hopefully, with what I am going to talk about today. Okay, my name is Pat Glynn. I'm an adjunct instructor here at Lakeland University, teaching music appreciation and music theory. Sometimes I teach rock history when that does show up, but that's once a blue moon. But so this presentation will focus primarily on music education as it applies to music appreciation and music theory. Now I start, and I'm very lucky to have a former student of one of my lectures filming me today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I usually start the first class of each semester in both music appreciation and music theory with a seemingly simple question: what is music, right? Like, we have to have some sort of, if we're talking about our biases, whether conscious or unconscious, we all start here. What is music? So I have the students, when we were online, when we were virtual, they did breakout groups. When we were in person, it's very easy for them to get together and discuss. And I have them come up by committee. They have to come up with a one-sentence definition of what is music. So I'd like you to just take a moment and think to yourself, can you come up very quickly with a one-sentence answer that cracks this nut? I see Val's nodding his head, so I know he's got an answer there. Would anyone like to share what you think, what your definition of music is?
I try.
Oh, please, thank you.
Maybe for me, I would say music is a creative expression of culture.
Okay, that's a wonderful definition. So that I would collect these answers from each of the groups, and then we'd go back through them. So creative, and so expression and culture. So those are the operative words.
I would say it's the essence of life.
The essence of life. Well, that's for some people. Yeah. Okay. Good. Anyone else want to take one more? Go ahead, Val.
The harmonic grammar of the relationship between objects.
Or you're going to go old school with Boethius. Okay. You're going to go to the Middle Ages. Yeah, okay, well, those are all great answers, but it leads us to this problem. How can we boil it down so that everyone has the same operating definition of music that allows us to talk about all kinds of music, both music that we know, music that we like, but music that perhaps we haven't contemplated yet. So of course we would accept those answers. That's a great answer, that's a great answer, that's a wonderful answer, it makes sense. And generally students come up with, and Tarzan can probably back me up here, the answers are these very warm and fuzzy, positive, and loaded with subjective terms, like enjoyment. Expression, which is definitely one aspect of music. Often we have humanity, although our developers of AI might have a problem with that today. Algorithms generating music and generating your likes and whatnot in Spotify. So what we like to use in our class, and I think even though it's a little sterile, it's had too much showbook, but it allows for us to talk about music on equal terms. All kinds of music, again, both music we've had experience with and contemplated, also music that we have not yet had a chance to enjoy. So we're creating an inclusive environment, right? That's what we want, an open discussion of music. Now, again, this leads us to objectivity. We've cleared out all the bias. There's no extra fact here, right? Just sound and silence, organized in time. Organization is the key. We need sound to have music, and hopefully, if you're not going to go bonkers, you have some sort of break from that sound. You can do silence. However, we very quickly run into a dead wall, and I start getting blank stares from students, and that's where I load them up with terms. Now, obviously, we need to be able to talk about music. We have to be able to to discuss music. We can't just listen to it. We do have to talk about it. But we start to run into issues in terms of the student's own cultural background, right? This course, the courses that I teach at Lakeland, they're designed for an American university, so it's all built on the foundation of this American enculturation. And that creates a problem, in particular for my classroom here at Lakeland, where I'm usually an inverted classroom where most of the students are out of culture instead of in culture. So it creates a particular problem and barriers to their learning experience. So in order to kind of address this cultural bias and talk about it, outline it, and then also provide some simple and practical solutions to it, the first thing I'd like to do today is outline the origins. Why is music taught as a subject in school in the first place, in particular history and appreciation? Find out why bias exists in the materials that we use, and I have in my backpack a whole bunch of heavy textbooks, which I'll try not to throw at you. And then looking at those materials, I'll compare some of the content that I am to teach my students as part of the stated learning objectives at basically most American universities, the same way. And after we've kind of outlined the existing bias, provide some a practical workaround in order to create a better learning environment for, in particular, our international, our global students, our non-enculturated students. So we just spent the first 20-minute discussion, our presentation about bias. More bias time. We have to define our usage of cultural bias and how it applies to our music classroom. The American Psychological Society says cultural bias is the tendency to interpret and judge phenomena in terms of the distinctive values, beliefs, and other characteristics of the society or community to which one belongs. That distinctive word becomes a problem, right? There's, in an international classroom, there is no distinctive nature, or the distinctive nature is the opposite of what the materials are intended for. And that's where the disconnect seems to happen, in particular, again, in our international or global classroom. So what does this mean? What is the impact of this disconnect? So there is a basic assumption that all students will have some sort of shared enculturation. Right? If you went through American public school, you learned all the kids' songs. In elementary school, maybe in junior high school, you were in choir or something. You have this kind of foundation stacked one upon the other before you get to higher education. Our out-of-culture kids do not have that. And again, this enculturation is all built around Western and American cultural cues, which I will talk about, again, the blank stare effect that I've experienced over the last 10 years here at Lakeland. Now, also tied into that, of course, because of the connection of religion to culture, there's a religious, in particular Christianity presents an issue, in particular for our students, most of whom do not have any sort of in-culture experience for Christianity. But what does this mean? Again, this is music. I'm talking about music, but music is an oral experience. It's listening. What is the impact on these students as listeners and thinking about music? There have been many studies. In 2016, there was a study by a group of researchers led by Stephen Demarest, I think it was at Northwestern University, and they found that students who were approaching music from an out-of-culture experience did not perform as well on music cognition and oral memory tasks. So given some sort of melodic, in this case it was related to melody, given some sort of melodic example, and when asked to recall or to think or to analyze that example, they did not perform as well as students who had prior experience as a part of their culture. And that effect is very clear in our classroom. So for me, that's the main concern here. That is where we start to begin. So now that we've outlined the cultural, the dangers of the cultural bias in terms of the learning environment for the students, why do we have it set up this way? Why are these students, and I would argue that even students in the United States today are in this situation. And I think to understand why cultural bias exists in music appreciation, music theory, we have to look at the history. Why do we have these courses as part of the curriculum? Now, I think it's best to we'll chop it up in 100-year segments going all the way back to the colonial period, because we always like to talk about the Puritans and the Pilgrims. It's always a nice topic of discussion. John Tufts is our first figure. Tufts writes the first music text as part of the effort for the singing school movement in colonial America. The same movement is happening in England. It's not just in the United States, but it is to raise the level of the performance at worship services. Before this, in the Puritan church, it was congregational singing, where somebody would be leading as kind of a cantor, and maybe it was, we would say, unprofessional compared to the music of Bach and the prior generation. But what this does is it brings into the idea of music literacy as being something important, something that should be taught. And most importantly, that religious music needs to be taught. It's essential. Fast forward 100 years, same region, of course, New England. We have Lowell Mason. Now, Lowell Mason is considered the father of music education in the United States. He founds the first institution of higher learning for music in Boston, the Boston Academy of Music. But more importantly, he's a really happy guy as well. He was vital in having music accepted in the Boston Public Schools as a legitimate subject. Before this, music was just a pastime. Now, because of his efforts, it's accepted as a subject, and voila, here I am in a tie and with a landing, right? So, thank you, Lowell Mason. However, he was also part of a very strong aesthetic movement in the 1800s called the Better Music Movement, which sought to kind of replace the homegrown, homespun American music, which had been around since the colonial period, with European models of both secular music, the classical music of the day, which I think even today I'll discuss how we are putting that forth, as well as religious music. He was also a composer, in addition to being, he was a banker, and of course a clergyman, as you can tell by his chapeau. But yeah, again, we're starting to begin this push to use classical music as the model for Europe, and to use Christian musical elements as well. Again, that's part of the culture at the time. It makes sense. In my classroom, I have a hard time rectifying. Another 100 years, and we finally get to see a woman. Hooray, women! Unfortunately, not all good. We have Frances E. Clark. Frances Clark was a music educator herself. She was a founding member of MENC, which is the Music Educators National Convention. Used to be the Music Supervisors National Convention, became MENC. A very influential group of music teachers across the United States. She was a music appreciation advocate. She also, and today this would be frowned upon, she also happened to be the educational division manager for the Victor Recording Company. So in a way that Washington works, public sector, private sector, she had the same kind of crossover and seemingly conflict of interest. However, she was widely lauded by the community of teachers at the time. Very influential person. So on the positive side, she gets teachers to start using new technology in the classroom. That's a positive, that's a plus. All right? Same with Mason. He gets music accepted as a topic and subject in school. That's a plus. However, we start with because she has such an outsized influence over what is taught, it is her aesthetic guides which are in line with Mason, this kind of better music movement that we're looking for. It's European music, that popular music is not a part of the discussion and actually should be avoided. We start to have this cultural bias really define what music is taught and how it is taught. But don't take my word for it. This is what they say. Lowell Mason, music should not be borrowed from places of amusement and which are less adapted to improve the tasteful, social, and moral conditions of the students. All right, so, all right, yes and no, okay. If we go on to Frances Clark, she's addressing the Federation of Women's Clubs. She was quite active. Again, this is the first part of the 20th century. Social movements are all the rage. think about temperance and the like. The love for music is innate, but the taste for music must be acquired like olives or persimmons. Which is, yeah, wow. So again, we're separating enjoyment from the appreciating of it. Now, I think that some of my students might agree with this. Given the last lecture I gave on opera on Thursday, I got many olive faces as opposed to. So what is the point here? Is that we are still teaching based on this model. We are imposing that you must study this because it's good for you. Not based on any other criteria, just some sort of conviction and older aesthetic values that we've inherited. So again, these materials that we are using are recycling these same ideas, the same values. So now I'd like to, after giving you the history of music and why we have music appreciation and music theory in class, I'd like to talk a bit about the materials that I'm using currently or have used currently. I've had an opportunity to use a bunch of different textbooks over the past 10 years. So I'd like to compare kind of A-B some material for you to help illustrate my point of this bias, long-standing bias in the materials as well. So the materials that I've used, of course, the one I'm using right now is Music and Appreciation by Roger Kanian. That's probably the most widely used music appreciation text. I've used previously The Enjoyment of Music, which, again, enjoyment. Okay. Now they're set up pretty much in the same way, full of olives and persimmons, but ultimately it's strikingly similar, right? It starts out with a chapter on fundamentals. We have to get established our vocabulary, whether it's an appreciation or theory. Then we go quickly, very quickly, into the narrative of Western classical music. So, and I'll show the breakdown of the amount of time that the students are expected to spend studying this part of music versus, again, the rest of music as a whole. At the end of each text of music appreciation, and almost none in music theory, we get popular styles. And it's kind of like an addendum at the end. And sometimes we get world music, what we would refer to as ethnomusicology. Okay, so the study of music of continuing traditions. So it becomes an afterthought. Now, I have to give some credit that these materials have evolved over the last 10 years since I started teaching at Lakeland. They've become more inclusive, especially for women. Initially, there were very few mentions of women, and I think over the last 10 years, there's been a very good effort to kind of change the discussion. Both when women are not part of what happens in the culture and discuss why that is, but also when there's an opportunity to talk about women. But other underserved populations are still kind of lacking. So if we take a look at this next slide, this is rather unscientific, but I think it kind of helps illustrate my point here, that most of what these courses are built around is this narrative of Western classical music. And I would say in advocacy of classical music. You know, the courses are designed, and this goes back to both Mason and Clark, that there's some sort of moral obligation involved in teaching this music, these olives and persimmons, getting people to like it. Now, I would argue that other types of music need to be included. I can send you the slide, no problem. Yeah, sure. I appreciate it. I'll just give them a little photobomb. So I would like to set you up with a matchup. Beethoven versus the rest of the world. Okay, not to go video game on you. Now, the argument for inclusion in music is not new. I wish I could say that I'm the first one, and I'm going to be YouTube famous in a minute. But this goes all the way back, I would say, to the 1940s. Howard McKinney, who was the head of music in my home state at Rutgers University, and also a music appreciation advocate, he said in the Music Educator's Journal that discussions of jazz and American folk music, as well as of Elizabethan madrigals and Gregorian chant, should be included. So not just focusing on the Western narrative, but things that are current and that people can relate to. Jazz was once current music. my bias, I will admit I'm a jazz musician. It's not necessarily all that current right now. It's very sad to say. But anyhow, in 1949, it was the most important, I would say, popular music. So again, this is not new. But how does jazz stand up against Beethoven in terms of content? I would, in looking at both of the music appreciation texts, they are equal. Now, I love, again, bias here, I love Beethoven. He dominates my iTunes collection. However, 8 pages in Forney, 12 pages in Kenyon are dedicated just to Beethoven, and an equal amount are dedicated to an entire genre of music with many, many hundreds of musicians that he studies. So we'll call this, just in terms of numbers, we have a draw, right? And actually this number has come up, I have to say, going back to prior versions or editions of the textbooks, this number, the ratio has changed. But what about hip hop? If jazz was the pop music of 1949, hip hop is the most important global music form today. What about hip hop? How many pages do you think exist for hip hop? 0. 0. There's one paragraph in one of the texts, and then there's a sentence. And the sentence related to hip hop is related to technology, music technology in the 20th century, which it is indeed an essential connection between music and technology. However, that's it. So that's a big disconnect. How about the music of the rest of the world? How about non-Western music? Any guess? Well, I'll go back, if I go back a slide here, you can see. The Kenyon tries. The Kenyon has a unit on non-Western music. And actually, Japanese music is discussed in the Kenyon, which is nice. It brings the class to a connection with our mostly Japanese student body. So it's West African and Japanese music. However, Forney does nothing. There's 0. There's no discussion of music of continuing traditions around the world. It's just absent. Which again, leads me to this. Why is that? Music is a universal concept. Why is there 75% of the material? Is that framing by 75% or 3/4? Does that work out better? So back up here. Sorry, I have to listen to that again. So it's pretty clear. Beethoven is orange. Sorry. So yeah, again, my argument here is that inclusion needs to happen if we're going to have our students have a more relatable experience in the classroom. There's more bias, but I am over 20 minutes here, so I'm going to skip over American bias because I'm American, so I can do that. So we'll move beyond American bias, and I will move on to talking about music theory in particular. I've focused primarily on this music appreciation business, but music theory is not immune. I've used also 2 textbooks over the last 10 years, and these are the 2 most widely used textbooks. Tonal Harmony is the book I used when I was an undergraduate years ago, and it's changed slightly. It has. It's evolved slightly, but not much. The Musician's Guide, again, I won't put my bias here, is the one I prefer to use, but it's not the one we currently use. And I'll explain the reasons for that in a second. But we're presented with this harmony versus other. We're talking about elements of music, whether it's melody, rhythm, harmony, texture. There is an emphasis on this concept of harmony, the supremacy of harmony over other musical elements. And we kind of see this musical snobbishness and bias just in the preface. In the Kenyon, they say, one thing that distinguishes Western art music, there's another interesting term, art, from many other kinds of music is the emphasis on harmony. In general, the music from other cultures, other than our, again, this shared enculturation, we're assuming that all students are from this American European tradition, is concerned less with harmony than with other aspects of music. Now, if you were a performing musician and going to onto a profession as a musician, learning about harmony is very, very important. But if you are a student who's pursuing music as a general studies requirement, maybe this is a little misplaced. Now, one of the reasons why I like Musician's Guide is that the approach is more practical. They say one of the most important things to remember about music theory is that it's all about music. How and why music sounds the way it does and what elements of a piece or performance move us. Right, that's a little warmer and fuzzier. Now they cover the same material, but the breakdown of materials, and if we had time I would get into it, but the breakdown of materials are, again, the difference between the two texts. Guide to Theory and Analysis gives students plenty of time to get enculturated in music by drawing on popular music examples, in addition to Christian music and other kind of in-culture examples, and then moves on to more complex topics which are really based on, especially Christian enculturation. And for our classroom, I had better results with this other textbook because of that. Okay, so I'm going to go through this one and go to the elephant in the room. Yeah, and I'm just going to, there we go, disconnect the screen. Music has not been, I'm not going to say escaped, but music has been a part of this discussion of critical race theory. And it's been a doozy. It has blown up the internet. And actually, there was a very widely viewed YouTube video by a pretty famous YouTuber named Adam Neely, taking on this same basic topic, but specific to music theory. Now, there is a music theory professor at Hunter College in New York City, Dr. Philip Ewell. Here's a slide of Dr. Ewell. He wrote a paper in 2020, Music Theory and the White Racial Frame. Quite a controversial, of course, 2020, we're right at the height of when critical race theory is really starting to be discussed. And he put this paper out, and it caused an uproar, especially, and this is more focused towards music theory rather than the other side of the point here where I'm talking about music appreciation. He posited that there is a structural and institutionalized racism that exists in music theory. Of course, it is hard to argue with the data he provides as a result of this, and that is, of course, lack of inclusion of minorities in music theory. Who is teaching music theory at American institutions? Mostly white men. And so I can't argue with those kind of outcomes, right? The data is there. I would say that specific for our classroom, the issues of having international students study music theory through this American framework, it's a little different, although it's connected tangentially, but it's more, again, this issue of nationality. Right? If you grew up in Japan, but I would say 80%, 90% of my students do, you don't have that same background. It isn't even contemplated as part of the structure of the course or the materials. So now, a lot of his argument was based around, can you separate the person in terms of their views from their ideas? Heinrich Schenker is probably the most influential music theoretician of the 20th century. I know all of you know who he is, right? No. But if you took music theory in higher ed as a music major, you would have been through his techniques. But he was also a very well-documented racist, as were other very famous classical composers, Richard Wagner being a world-class racist and bigot, writing a whole treatise on the negatives of Judaism. So his argument, I think, is founded in this idea that can you separate the ideas of these people from their actual work? Again, I accept Dr. Ewell's argument that it has merits and it has values, but for our purposes and for the global classroom, I'd say it's a little different. It's more about enculturation rather than this kind of institutionalized and structural racism. So what are the solutions? How do we get around this in a practical way? I'm not looking to upset the apple cart because I'm not looking to get myself unemployed. I'm adjunct. But I do think that the students need to be better served. And I think the first thing we could do is be honest about what we're teaching. Instead of saying music appreciation or music and history and culture, which is how we label my appreciation course here, or music theory, just slap the word Western on it, and there you go. Just label it honestly as what it is. But if you are going to teach music as a universal concept, it has to be more inclusive. It cannot be 75% a discussion of the narrative of classical music. It just leaves too many people behind. And we become, by default, I'm a salesperson for classical music. I love classical music, but I'm not here to impose my bias on my students, right? But we need to include more music. Ethnomusicology, world music, right? We discussed that. I showed one of the texts has 0. The theory texts do not contain anything about outside of Western music, so it does not exist. Pop music, please. All right, if you want to keep students involved and engaged, include popular forms. And again, this argument goes back to 1940s. Game music. Those of you who are gamers, raise your hand. Do you have any gamers in class? Oh, that was a very top secret. Don't have it later. If I do the same thing in my classes, I have a lot of students who, this can be a way in, if you're looking to relate music to their everyday experience, use game music. There's really almost nothing mentioned in the materials. So that's something that I end up having to supplement. I mentioned this, but we don't have time for me to spend another 20 minutes to talk about it, but we have to balance out sacred versus secular to match the students' lives today. I spend a lot of time, and I just did on Tuesday, talking about the Roman Catholic Mass, which I was born and raised Roman Catholic. I know when to stand up and sit down and kneel, and it works, but for my students, they don't have that experience. And for a music course, there's too much weight to put on that. So we need to supplement and substitute certain examples that would be in culture for ones that will be in culture by taking out culture experiences. So for melody, if I choose a simple America the Beautiful, right? It's something that American kids are taught in school. It's a wonderful melody. Japanese students don't know it. Well, supplement it with something that maybe they do know. You know, something from Doyo, or even something as simple as the Sukiyaki song, Ue Ue de Ano. Right? So something that they're familiar with, to give them a better chance to understand the concept instead of focusing on the example itself. All right, so in conclusion, now that I'm way over, sorry folks, and nobody's asleep, thank you. Again, today I presented the argument, and hopefully I demonstrated the fact that a cultural bias exists. That bias is clear in the materials that we use in higher education, particularly in the United States. And we, in order to better reach our students, especially these students in this global classroom, we need to update our materials to better reflect how music relates to them personally. So we often say in classical music there are the 3 B's. They are, go ahead. Come on, Val.
Beethoven.
All right, there's one.
Bach.
And
Brahms.
Brahms. There's the 3 B's. Those are great, but we need to add more B's. It's not just 3 B's. So in terms of ethnomusicology, why not study Batak, which is the rhythm of the Yoruba people, which is kind of the ancestor rhythm of music of the Western Hemisphere, right? Or
Backstreet Boys.
There's a B. Backstreet Boys. Can I put my bias in there? Cardi B. There's a B. Beyonce. Yeah, absolutely. Or bossa nova. So start including these other styles that might give, I think, these global students, or some of you even, a better chance at relating to music. And then, of course, still keeping this discussion of Western music as well. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm sorry to go so long, but I really appreciate it.
Luckily, we have more time, so anybody want to ask any questions or make any comments?
Or throw tomatoes?
Not necessary, not at all.
Yeah, please.
Best guitar solo from a rock and roll band
My bias?
in your professional
In
experience.
my profession, best rock guitar solo. I would have to. That's hard. I mean, I'm a big Jimmy Page fan, so I might have to go.
Give us 3 or 4.
Well, Led Zeppelin too. What about yourself?
I No, excuse me. Maybe Hotel California.
Okay, yeah.
Three Boys, Joe.
The Backstreet Boys, although I lived in Orlando when that band was touring, and I knew the touring musicians in the Backstreet Boys now. But, yeah, so I would say maybe Live and Love and Made. Yeah, that's a great song. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions, folks?
Just a comment that it seems somewhat similar to literature.
Yeah.
The realm of literature and what's the canon and, how do we define that? And
Yeah,
what's the
but
purpose of literature and.
Yeah. And there's nothing, I don't want to say that there's anything wrong with teaching classical music. I love classical music. I spent a ton of money learning how to play it, but also filling up my iTunes with, actually, I still buy physical CDs. I'm a Luddite that way. But there's nothing wrong with studying that. But however, I think it needs updating. Yeah, instead of just that kind of one perspective, that one bias. Yeah. Any other? Yes, please.
Yeah, so when you're talking about developing taste in music,
Yes.
is there an argument to make for starting with classical music?
Well, again, my point is that I don't want to develop the students' taste. I would give them as much information as I possibly can. And thanks to instructors like you guys, critical thinking is an important aspect, right? So if they have the critical thinking skills, then they can, we all have our likes and dislikes. My students often write these listening assignments 7 times a semester where they have to give their personal opinion. So the selection alone is indoctrinating, and they have to cover this material. But I'm more important. It's more important to me. I think it's more essential for them to somehow explain their opinion, their feelings about these things, instead of what I think that they're supposed to think. Right? This kind of indoctrination of taste. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Anything else?
You guys hungry?
All right, well, shall we say then to
Yes.
be continued over lunch?
Yes, thank you very much.